I'm John Micklethwait of Bloomberg, and the theme now is reset and American foreign policy. And we have with us to discuss that Ambassador Nick Burns and Dr. Meghan O'Sullivan. Both don't need any more introduction than Googling them, and there is a lot to see. In terms of resetting American foreign policy, I think it's fair to say roughly where we are. And I think we're at the end of an era where America first has been tried and doesn't seem to work particularly well. We're also at the end, or hopefully quite close to the end of COVID, where I just checked this morning, America is close to 1,500 deaths for every million inhabitants, whilst China claims a number of 3, which would make it 500 times better. Even if it's lying a bit, that would still be a big gap. And from my perspective, in Britain, America has a lot to do. So the issue is, what should America do in terms of rebuilding alliances? And I thought I'd begin with Nick and ask, what do you think is possible for the Biden administration?
They're consciously trying to recreate a global leadership role for the United States after the very weak performance of President Trump. So what are they doing? They've decided they're going to show up where it really counts, and they're going to lead. So we're back in the World Health Organization, and Secretary Blinken said that we're actually going to pay the $200 million that we owe the WHO at a time of pandemic. We're back in the climate change agreement, and I think that's very important to see this historic commitment that President Biden has made to put the United States back as the second largest carbon emitter into the climate change debate. Consciously, you see them third, in addition to showing up and acting on climate, it's alliances. It's the great power differential of NATO, which gives the United States so much strength in the world versus Russia, for instance, which has no true allies in the world. And President Biden, at the first NATO defense ministers meeting, they're recreating the historic role that the United States has always played in NATO. I'm a former ambassador to NATO and understand how important that is. And they're doing the same thing in East Asia, where Secretary Blinken last week participated in the first foreign ministers quad meeting of this administration. That's India, Australia, Japan, and the United States, designed to limit China. And the fourth thing I think we should do is compete with China and make sure that the United States is using all the tools that we have in our arsenal to limit China militarily in the Indo-Pacific, to force China to play by the rules on trade, to stand up in the values debate we're having, where Xi Jinping has been asserting that the authoritarian state model is the right model. We don't believe that. And so now you see President Biden very vocal in criticizing China on Hong Kong, on the Uyghurs, Secretary Blinken calling that a genocide, standing up for human rights from Navalny to the people of Belarus. And this defense of democracy is so important for the United States to make.
I just want to ask Meghan, Nick put across a whole series of points, which were essentially America getting back into the game. And I suppose I was going to ask you, do you think that's enough?
Well, I would say that all the points that Nick made are appropriate, and there's certainly areas that the Biden administration is working on. There are two things I would add. First is, as your question implies, it's not enough for us to just think we can repair our reputation by addressing our actions abroad. A lot of our credibility has taken a hit in the last years because of events at home. And, most obviously, I would say that there are now question marks around America's competence when we look at our ability and the way that we have handled COVID, but also the extent to which our democracy really is a model for other countries, I think was called into question, particularly by the events of January 6th here in the US. So I think the first thing is that we really need to keep in mind the phrase, which is now very commonplace, that foreign policy does begin at home. And the second thing I would mention, building on Nick's comments about climate, this is an area where I do believe the United States can really demonstrate that it is not only willing to lead, but it is capable of leading. And so I think in many respects, this new focus on climate is a twofer for the Biden administration. It's an issue that the Biden administration and many Americans care deeply about, the importance of tackling climate change and decarbonizing economies. But then there's also the opportunity to use this issue to demonstrate that America is back on the global stage.
But all those things, to some extent, they're merely coming back into kind of arenas where America has not been present before. And I wondered whether there's anything in this idea that Biden forms an alliance of democracies. He reaches out not just to the Europeans, because strangely in Europe, we're not that enthusiastic about being told that America first is the policy. But he reaches out to America, to Europeans in terms of democracy, but he also reaches out to people in countries in Asia.
I think it does make sense. President Biden spoke on the campaign trail about a coalition of democracies. And if you agree, and I certainly do, that China and Russia, the two authoritarian powers, are the greatest threat to the United States and to Europe and to our East Asian allies, then forming a worldwide association of democracies, having a summit meeting to work to talk about the strengths of democracy and to work on defending democracy when it's challenged, it makes great sense to me. The virtue that we already have, of course, is NATO. That's an alliance of democracies. Our Indo-Pacific alliances, Japan, South Korea, Australia, our partnership with India, that's an alliance of democracy too. So I think you can actually have overlapping efforts here.
What about this to Meghan is that all this sounds wonderful, but surely the main thing that allies, people in Europe, people in Asia, are going to say is, what about trade? Here is the thing that if you could really help us, if you got involved in that, if you welcomed us in. But Biden has got quite a protectionist element in his party, quite a protectionist element behind him.
Well, I do think that trade is one of the areas where we're not going to see a lot of quick action out of the Biden administration. I think there will be some elements that provide relief from the Trump approach towards trade, which really had this unusual quality of using tariffs against our partners and allies. And I don't think we're going to see a lot of that. But in terms of really spearheading new trade agreements, I think that's going to be slow in coming from the Biden administration. And when it does come, there's going to be a heavy focus on issues like labor and the environment. So I think that isn't the area where the allies are going to be most satisfied, but there are some dimensions that I do think there's a lot of common cause. Let me just mention on the democracy alliance issue that Nick spoke about. I agree that I think this is a valuable forum for the United States to partner with others on. And I think that's because there are a lot of issues out there today that need to be dealt with collectively and that will be most usefully dealt with by a group of countries that share a common set of values. And one of them I think about is technology and the regulation of technology, and having conversations among democracies about how they're going to handle this, I think is much more useful than doing it all individually.
Nick, do you think that's practical? Surely technology is one of those areas where the world is rapidly getting divided. Admittedly, Meghan pointed out democracies, but we've got the prospect of an internet splitting into two, with China on one side, the rest of the West on the other.
I think it's important and it's very practical. David Ignatius wrote a column in the Washington Post saying there's an idea brewing in the Biden administration, and that is a Tech 10 or a Tech 12. The big technology countries of the world that are democracies need to band together in the digital age to protect our technologies on issues like 5G and others from the Chinese. And so I think it's a very important idea. A second idea, not just on technology, if Japan, the European Union, the UK, and US coalesced on some of the big trade differences that all of us have with China, that's well more than 60% of global GDP. That's real weight that we can bring to the competition with China.
Can I come back to this idea, just to use that technology as an example? You wander around the capitals of Europe, and I think you'd find quite a lot of people, when they talked about let's unite behind technology, would immediately say, why should we unite behind big American companies, which we're already slightly fed up with? Isn't this one of those things where America is so excited just to get back into the arena that there will still be real splits with people?
I would say that the conversation around technology is changing in the United States as well. And I think our partners and allies need to recognize that we're having conversations here. And I think there is going to be more of a consensus for more regulation in some respects. I don't know how far it will go, but it's a changing landscape on the part of America. I'd also say that technology is not just about, big US tech companies permeating other societies and countries, but it also has to involve questions like, to what extent does America and the West and its allies want to decouple with China, and to what extent does it not? I think the reality is that we need to talk about this whole question of decoupling and technology with China in a much more sophisticated way. There are areas where it's going to make sense for us collectively not to be intertwined with China, but there are other areas where we're not going to want that. And I think having a common vision, a common understanding among countries is going to be really critical to realizing that into practicality.
Can I ask you both one question, both to end? And that's what, if you were Joe Biden, where would you be most worried about at the moment? What, looking ahead over the next 4 years, where do you see the kind of unexpected problems coming from?
This is the most obvious answer, but I think it has the virtue of being correct, is that the area on the international landscape that's most worrying is the U.S. relationship with China. If the Biden administration can find a way to stabilize the U.S.-China relationship, which doesn't mean kumbaya, it doesn't mean realizing the vision of a decade ago of getting China to fully embrace international norms and institutions as we saw them, but just to find a way that the U.S. and its partners and allies around the world can peacefully coexist with an economy that is as large and dynamic as China's, but is also underpinned by a very different set of values. If we can find a way to have that relationship, again, be stable and be peaceful, I think that'll be a huge opportunity. But going back to your question, I also think it is the greatest challenge on the global horizon for the Biden administration.
I agree with Meghan. The most important foreign policy challenge we have is competing with China, standing up to China, but yet finding a way, as Meghan has suggested, to work with the Chinese. But I do think, President Biden has got to think about the home front first. It's the issue that Meghan raised. And on issue after issue, from pandemic to recession to our racial crisis to the January 6th crisis, clearly the United States needs to stabilize the home front, begin to knit people back together as Americans so that then we can be successful overseas.
The nation building begins at home. I cannot think of a better way to introduce this whole theme than what you both said. Nick Burns, Meghan O'Sullivan, thank you very much